Well, good morning again, everyone. Always great to be with you. Great to see so many of you in the sanctuary today, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. We're so very grateful to have you here. I have to say that I love those words from the Taoist teacher and poet Lao Tzu. I think they point so eloquently and powerfully and simply to how deeply interconnected peace is at every level of our lives, from the individual human heart to peace among the nations and peace between humankind and this planet that is our home. Now, before I share a few thoughts about peace and courage and justice, let me just reiterate again, feel like this is Announcement Sunday here at the UU Congregation of Charlottesville. Again, to remind you about Reverend Leah's celebration next Sunday for her 30 extraordinary years here at the UU Congregation of Charlottesville. You know, I've only been working with Leah for a few short months, but I have been so impressed and inspired by her brilliance, her creativity, her passion for this congregation, and her wonderful kindness and compassion. Now, look, I know I'm preaching literally to the choir here, but I do hope that many of you will take a few minutes today or tomorrow, but by tomorrow, please, to record a brief video or send me an email with your thoughts, your stories, and your appreciations about Reverend Leah. Okay. Now, whenever I preach a sermon about peace, the first thing that always comes to mind, I'm sorry to say, is just how little of it there seems to be in our lives, our communities, our country, and yes, in the world. How I wish I could begin by telling you that I'm feeling really hopeful and optimistic about the prospects for peace in the world. But, and this has become such a refrain on so many Sunday mornings for me, this week we saw another terrible shooting, this time in Raleigh, North Carolina. In addition, 2 courtroom verdicts that were handed down this week reminded us of the horrific shootings that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary School and at the high school in Parkland, Florida. I have to say that I have offered thoughts and prayers so many Sundays after one of these shootings that the words just don't seem to matter anymore. But as bad as this litany of violence that continues, as bad as that is, we cannot and must not give in to despair and resignation. So often after one of these mass shootings, we hear how impossible it is to find anything resembling a solution, or that the only answer is more guns and more violence. I, for one, refuse to accept the idea that there is nothing we can do, or that the only option is to fight fire with fire. And the place where I think we can begin to find hope and courage is right here in the individual human heart, and right here in communities like the UU Congregation of Charlottesville. For all of its challenges and all of its growing edges, I do believe that religious communities can provide a place and a space to recommit ourselves to the journey towards peace and justice. And I would like to make that beginning today by echoing the words of our reading a few minutes ago, and simply say that there cannot be peace in our families, our neighborhoods, our cities, or in the world unless there is peace in our hearts. And that connection between inner and outer peace, between a peaceful heart and a peaceful world, always reminds me of a story from the Christian scriptures, the Gospels, and I'd like to just remind you about that story today. I'm sure many of you have heard it before, but if you haven't, here we go. One day, while crossing a body of water in a boat, Jesus and his disciples encounter a powerful storm. That slide that's up on the screen right now is a painting by Rembrandt called The Storm at Sea. I'll just mention that unfortunately, this painting was one that was stolen from the Gardner Museum in Boston some years ago, and it is still missing. So I guess thank God for Google that we still have the image, but we don't have the painting. So in this story, the boat is tossed about violently and fear and panic grip the disciples. Meanwhile, Jesus is in the back of the boat, fast asleep. When the disciples are certain that the boat is going to capsize, they wake Jesus up, plead for his help, and ask if he doesn't care that we are all about to die. Now, according to the story, Jesus calms the raging storm with these 3 words: "Peace, be still." After the wind ceases and the waters calm, Jesus turns to his disciples and questions why they are so consumed with fear and why they have so little faith. Now, I must say that there is something about this story that really speaks to me right now, especially in these violent and uncertain times. I have to say that many days it feels as if I am one of those disciples in the boat, rocking violently, fearful and anxious. And I think what speaks to me about this story is not the possibility of a superhuman or a supernatural miracle in which Jesus somehow has control over the laws of nature. What speaks to me is the power and simplicity of 3 words: peace, be still. Peace, be still. When I read and reread those words, or even say them out loud and then take time to breathe, that underlying sort of fear and anxiety begins to wane. And the storm that so often plagues my heart and my spirit begins to calm, even if just for a little. Now, we have no way of knowing what really happened that day, or if Jesus and his disciples actually got caught in that storm. The whole story could very well be a story. But if they did encounter a storm that made them fearful for their lives, I'm guessing that the miracle in that moment wasn't Jesus rewriting the laws of nature, but rather his calming the storm in their hearts and minds. In that moment, Jesus calmed the disciples with his peaceful presence and his calming words, urging them to be as he was, still, breathing, and to see that there is an alternative to fear. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. And I think that those 3 simple words offer us the beginning of a path towards a world of peace and justice. I know it may sound overly simplistic, but I believe that if we can simply begin to breathe, to be still, and to experience that inner peace, we can calm the storms and the fears in our own hearts. And as Jesus demonstrated that day in the boat, the calm and stillness in one heart radiates outward and has the power to calm the storms raging in other hearts and all around us. So how exactly does that work? How can peace in one heart lead to peace and justice in the world? Well, the answer, I think, can be found in an observation made by spiritual teachers, mystics, and leading important figures in almost all of the world's religious traditions. As we begin to discover and develop places of peace within ourselves, that inner peace begins to transform us and transform how we perceive and interact with others. Rather than seeing another as a threat or as an enemy, a peaceful heart enables us to begin to see them as a fellow human being, flawed and broken, fearful and perhaps suspicious, just as we are. And the moment we can begin to see another as we see ourselves, I think the seeds of genuine and lasting peace have been planted. Thich Nhat Hanh, the wonderful, recently deceased Buddhist priest and teacher, has written very powerfully about the connections between inner peace and our deep connections to others, which he calls, and he sort of invented a word here, he calls it interbeing. Interbeing. He says that when we experience a sense of inner peace and shared presence, we become deeply aware of the unity and oneness at the heart of all existence. And in those moments, we cannot help but see a sibling rather than an enemy, including those with whom we may differ or share little in common. Now, the question becomes, okay, we see that. How does that, can you actually change the world, change a law, create justice that way? The answer is yes. And I want to share a story with you now that I think illustrates this, the power of peace, of a peaceful heart, and peace and nonviolence to remake the world. This story takes place quite a few years ago in Nashville, Tennessee, in the winter and spring of 1960. It begins with the determination of a group of mostly African-American college students to end segregation at restaurants and lunch counters in the city of Nashville. The students chose to use nonviolent methods, in this case, sit-ins, to raise awareness about the injustice of segregation and to pressure city leaders to change unjust and discriminatory laws. Now, prior to launching the sit-in campaign, the students took extensive training in nonviolent resistance that was offered by an extraordinary minister and one of my real heroes, a man named James Lawson. Lawson had studied Gandhi's methods in India and was one of the first people to introduce those methods to another young minister you may have heard of, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Here's an image of Lawson leading one of those workshops in Nashville. Reverend Lawson, by the way, is still living. He's now, I think, in his early or mid-90s. Still living, still preaching. He's an incredible, incredible human being. Now, during these training sessions, Lawson and the students prayed, meditated, and sang together. They engaged in what the civil rights movement came to call a process of self-purification. And what was meant by that was that they sought to cultivate deep-seated peace and compassion in their hearts. And they also role-played interacting with their adversaries, if you will. Lawson taught the students to never lose sight of the humanity of the oppressor, even in the midst of the most violent behavior. He also taught them to try and make eye contact with their adversary so that each individual could see into the heart of another. As Lawson famously taught them, if they could follow the path of an eye to an eye, rather than an eye for an eye, the students could transform hatred and violence into justice and peace. Well, the sit-ins began in February of 1960. 60, and from the outset, they were marked by courageous nonviolence on the part of the students and hateful violence on the part of the citizens of Nashville and the Nashville police. There's an image of some of the protesters sitting in at one of the lunch counters. Now, throughout the campaign, one of the most important student leaders and another true heroine of the civil rights movement was a woman named Diane Nash. Diane Nash is the woman wearing the glasses, sitting at the lunch counter there. From the beginning of the campaign, Diane Nash demonstrated extraordinary skill and wisdom. She possessed an uncanny ability to remain calm and centered in the face of the most vicious insults and violent attacks. She was also able, as Lawson had taught, to find at least a shred of humanity in the midst of the most inhumane behavior. Without question, Diane Nash embodied the power and the blessings of a peaceful and nonviolent heart. After 2 months of courageous sit-ins, attacks by angry mobs, and mass arrests by the police, tensions reached a boiling point in Nashville when the home of a prominent black attorney who had defended the students in court was firebombed. The following day, student activists marched to City Hall to confront Nashville's segregationist mayor, Ben West. A few weeks earlier, the mayor had ordered Nashville's police to stand aside so that angry mobs could beat the students, and then had ordered the police to arrest the students rather than those engaging in mob violence. That's Mayor West there standing on the left. When the students reached City Hall, he, as you can see in this picture, met them on the steps. At first, the mayor responded angrily and defensively, blaming the students, those troublemakers, for increasing tensions and provoking violence, including the bombing of the attorney's home. Well, it was at this moment that Diane Nash, and you can see her there in the picture, stepped forward to confront Mayor West. And this is one of the least well-known and most iconic moments in the history of the civil rights movement. Rather than shouting at the mayor or even blaming him for the violence he had ordered and condoned, Diane Nash looked the mayor right in the eye and asked him in a calm, courageous, and resolute voice if he felt that it was right to discriminate against other human beings on the basis of race or skin color. Mayor West, who was expecting anger in a shouting match, was caught off guard by this reasoned appeal to his humanity. He hesitated and responded that, in theory, discrimination, I don't support that. Diane Nash didn't settle for platitudes or empty words. She persisted and pressed the mayor to follow the logic of his statement. Then, Mr. Mayor, are you recommending that the lunch counters be desegregated? Confronted again by this determined appeal to his fairness and to human dignity, the mayor paused, thought for a moment, and then simply answered, "Well, yes, I do." The students erupted in applause, and in a matter of just a few weeks, Nashville's lunch counters were desegregated. When he was interviewed sometime after his encounter with Diane Nash, and I think you could probably watch this on YouTube, Mayor West tried to explain what happened to him in that moment. He said, "I found that I had to answer her questions frankly and honestly, that I didn't agree that it was morally right to refuse them service. I got a lot of criticism, but if I had to answer that question again, I would answer it in the same way because it was a moral question, and it was one I had to answer as a man and not as a politician. That moment, that courage that Diane Nash showed, I think is an example, is a case study, if you will, in the transformative power of peace and nonviolence. A power that can, as Dr. King said so frequently, make a way out of no way. Rather than following the path Mayor West had chosen over the preceding days and weeks, a path of intimidation and harassment and violence, Diane Nash and her fellow students let the peace in their hearts and the courage of their convictions guide them. They boldly and courageously challenged an unjust status quo and put their lives on the line. But in doing so, they never resorted to the cruelty, the violence, and the hatred of their oppressors. Instead, they followed the path of the peaceful heart, a path that enabled them to change the world by resisting oppression, stirring the conscience, and touching the humanity of their oppressor. Now, Diane Nash didn't stop with Nashville's lunch counters. She was a leader and organizer of the Freedom Rides. She took part in countless other sit-ins across the South. She was a founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, frequently known as SNCC. And she was a key organizer and strategist in the Alabama Voting Rights Campaign that eventually resulted in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For all of her extraordinary contributions to justice, democracy, and nonviolence, I'm guessing, and maybe I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong, that many of you have never heard of Diane Nash. I first learned about her incredible courage and brilliance from reading a wonderful book that was written some years ago by the late writer David Halberstam called The Children. And this was a book that focused on the history of those folks in the movement who were not getting all the headlines and that the history books have consistently lifted up. But like so many, and especially so many women of color, Diane Nash's contributions have generally been ignored and minimized. Although it came many years later than it should have, I am happy to say that just a few weeks ago, Diane Nash was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And here's a picture of President Biden putting the Medal of Freedom on her, around her shoulders. Diane Nash, I think, is 85. If you ask me, she should have got that when she was 25. But now, President Biden, at the ceremony, when he was giving the medal out to Diane Nash and others, he said of her, he said, her activism echoes the call of freedom around the world today. And yet, Diane is the first to say that the medal is shared with hundreds of thousands of patriotic Americans who sacrificed so much for the cause of liberty and justice for all. And by the way, the president said, Diane asked me to make sure to add that part because she didn't want to take all the credit herself. I wonder if that's one of many reasons why history doesn't remember, because Diane Nash has a heart filled with humility. It is the courage, the activism, and the accomplishments of people like Diane Nash. It's that gives me hope this day. Cultivating peace in our hearts is the way to peace in our communities and in our world. We will never make our lives or this world safer by turning our homes, our schools, our religious communities, and our world into arsenals of fear and hate. Rather, we must have the courage to do the hard work of peace and justice, work that makes it possible to transform both hateful hearts and unjust systems of oppression. Look, I know that sounds pretty idealistic, in the world we live in today, a world that is so badly broken. But as James Lawson, Diane Nash, and all the courageous students in Nashville proved in 1960, peace and nonviolence are stronger than vengeance. And they can, in Dr. King's famous words, tear down gigantic mountains of evil. So I'm going to do my best to follow the path of peace, the path of Gandhi and King, of James Lawson and Diane Nash. And that path begins right here in my heart and in my life and in your hearts and in your lives. So my invitation to all of us today is to let peace and nonviolence be our guide. Let peace begin with prayer and meditation, with quiet and with stillness. Let peace begin as our hearts open to the dignity and the humanity of others, including those with whom we may differ and disagree. And let peace and justice begin with our courage and determination to move beyond these walls so that we may be instruments of peace and justice in the world. I don't know if committing ourselves to cultivating peace in our hearts and to being instruments of peace in the world, I don't know how far that will go in healing all the brokenness around us. But I do know that if we choose to sit behind walls of fear and indifference, things will never change. So let us now rise in body or spirit and sing This Is My Song, hymn number 159 in the gray hymnal. And let this beautiful song be our call and our commitment to build a world of peace, a peace that begins with you and with me. Amen. Blessed be. Thank you for listening, and please rise.